Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
This is the Networking RX podcast. I'm Frank Agin, founder and president of AmSpirit Business Connections, and your host for this episode. Thank you for joining me. Let me share a little story. I was at an AmSpirit Business Connections meeting, and this was a couple months ago during the height of the coronavirus. And at the meeting, well, just for those people who are not involved with AmSpirit Business Connections, it's a structured meeting, and it always starts very similarly. We read a charter, we go through some information, introduce our guests, and then we go around and have the members talk about themselves. And some chapters will have a little change to that, or have a little variation to that. They might have a question for members to answer. For example, around Halloween a question might be, what was your favorite Halloween costume? People will be able to remark on that. And it's just a way for people to quickly get to know one another. Well, this particular chapter, the president's question was simply this: what good happened to you, or what good did you do for somebody else? Which I thought was an interesting question. And the first person he called upon, going around, we're doing this all on a Zoom meeting, the first person he called on was the banker, Adrian Woodring. She's with Key Bank. And fair enough, I don't know if she knew the question was coming, but she paused real quickly and she said, I was slated to get out of work at 2 o'clock. Banking was an essential business, and so she went to work most days. She was getting out of work at 2 o'clock. She said it never happens on time. Ended up getting out of there about 2:15, 2:30. And as I'm driving out of work, I noticed that there's a woman, and she said, Adrian estimated that she was 6 to 7 months pregnant, pushing her car. And Adrian kind of pulled up alongside of her, rolled her window down, and said, "Ma'am, what are you doing?" So, "Well, I ran out of gas. I'm just pushing my car." And Adrian told her, "Get back in your car. I'm going to pull around, and I'm going to help you." So Adrian pulled around. This is, again, Adrian sharing the story. She pulled around, parked her car. I don't know how she did it, but she recruited a couple other people, probably flagged them down and said, "Hey, please help me." And together they pushed this young woman's car to safety, certainly off the road, to, where it could be parked. And Adrian then went to the woman and said, "Listen, I'm going to take you. I'm going to, get some gas." So Adrian took this young woman, and they got in Adrian's car, and they, just as they're driving to the gas station, just had a conversation. And the woman remarked, "Yeah, I'm pregnant. I just lost my job. Had been laid off." And there was a lot of that going on during the coronavirus. It's always happening. There's always somebody in transition. But she had revealed that, she was going to an interview, or she was heading somewhere, hopeful of making it to the gas station, or hopeful of being able to make it where she was going and back. She really didn't have any money. So what Adrian did was Adrian went ahead and filled up her gas can with gas, and then also proceeded to buy her a $25 gas card at the gas station, because the woman didn't have money and she was without a job, just trying to help her out. And then Adrian brought her back to her car and helped her put gas in the tank and make sure that the car started up. And then Adrian proceeded to hand her $100 in cash that Adrian had. Which, as I'm listening to this story, I'm like, oh my gosh, wow, this is, this gets better and it gets better and it gets better. The funny part of the story was Adrian was done, and the chapter president then turned to me and said, "Frank, what do you have to share?" And I just I joked, but I'm like, I've got to follow that. But what Adrian did, and I'm going to work this around to kind of the lesson today here on the Networking RX podcast. What Adrian did was very generous, was extremely generous. And I think that's great. I think that's great. There are no buts following that. But well, there's a but. What I want to use it for is I want to use it as kind of a lesson. Because people come to me all the time and they say, Frank, how can I be more giving? How can I be more generous? They've bought into the notion that doing things for others is really a great way to generate success for yourself. I certainly think a lot more highly of Adrian. Not that I didn't to begin with, but it's just it's I'll always look at her as somebody who's extremely generous because of that story. And I think the people in her chapter will do the same thing. And when people look at you in that light, that okay, here's somebody who's truly looking to add value to the world, we are predisposed to want to help them more. We'll go out of our way to help those people more. And so I think that ultimately benefits Adrian, not just in her chapter, but just her standing in her community. And so people come to believe that, and they want to know, how can I become more generous in my day-to-day activities? And I think Adrian's story, the story that Adrian has shared, is really a good illustration in that generosity is really kind of a slippery slope. I mean, Adrian pulled over to help somebody, and that in this day and age, that's not a small thing. It's not a small thing. There was a time long before cell phones where if you saw somebody pulled over on the side of the road, you would help them, and then you get a few stories going through the news cycle of people being abducted, and people are less likely to do those things anymore. Now, I don't know, Adrian's office is in the Dublin area, and Dublin is northwest part of Columbus, Ohio. It's a relatively well-to-do suburb. I wouldn't call it rich per se, but it's relatively well-to-do. It's upper middle class. So it's not like she's in the bad part of town or something like that. But still, she stopped, and it probably helped that the woman was 6 to 7 months pregnant. Might it have been different if it was a burly guy pushing his car? Perhaps, and it doesn't really matter. If it were a burly guy pushing his car, Adrian may not have sensed the need. But here, a woman who's 6 to 7 months pregnant pushing her own car, there's a need there. And so Adrian goes and she pushes the car, and or she has the woman get back in her car, circles around, recruits people to push the car, and they push the car, and then asks the person, oh, what's the problem, and then finding out what that next problem is, and solving it. Listen, let me drive you to get gas. Oh, you don't have money? I will pay for the gas. You don't have money? Let me buy you a gas card so you have more than just the 2 gallons I bought. Oh, you're really down on your luck. You've lost your job. Here's $100. And it really kind of usually the term slippery slope is meant in a bad way, but in here it's really kind of a good way because, Adrian has done just a little something, found out there's a little more need and done a little more and done a little more, and then kind of finishes up with that, that big, $100 gift. And the woman probably doesn't even know who Adrian is. She has no expectation that anything's ever going to come back to her other than the good karma that she's kind of dealt out into the world. And if you're a believer in karma, divine intervention, it will come back to you. But the point in this is with respect to generosity is if you want to be a more generous person, stop looking for the big thing. You don't need to find the big thing to be generous. Giving $100 to somebody, that's a big thing. It's not a huge thing per se, but it's a big thing. Look for the little things to do. Look for just holding the door open for somebody. Looking, just the little things that you can possibly be doing. Parking a little farther away at the store, recognizing that you're able-bodied and there are people who are older who probably would prefer to have something a little closer. Look for those little things, and when you find the little things, you'll start to find the bigger things. Again, it's a slippery slope, this generosity thing. And when you find the little bigger things, there'll be other bigger things, and so on and so forth. And you can stop whenever you want. Well, you can stop, and I don't expect Adrian to fund this woman's entire life, or hey, let me get your kid through college, kind of a thing. So she could stop at any point, and maybe $100 is exactly where it stops, and that's fine. The story's great just like that. And you can stop wherever you want. But if you're looking to get started being generous, the best thing to do is to look for the little things that you can do for others. People that you know, people you don't know, people you may never encounter ever again. Do something for them. And if you look for those opportunities, you'll be more in tune, and you'll find bigger opportunities as time goes on. Before we wrap up, let me end with this. If you know of an entrepreneur, business owner, or professional that seems to enjoy networking, appears well connected, and is somewhat involved with the chamber or professional networking organization, they would be a good person for me to meet. As you know, being networked is vital to success, and receiving referrals is the most effective means of generating business. So if you know of such a business professional, work into a conversation this rhetorical question. If you had a choice, would you rather be a renter or the person who owns the building? Now, they'll probably chuckle at the question and indicate somehow that they would obviously like to be the owner of the building rather than the person who pays the rent. When they do, indicate that you're familiar with the franchise opportunity through AmSpirit Business Connections, where they're not just being part of a professional networking organization, but rather they're an owner, instrumental in building professional networking groups and profiting from them. From there, suggest they contact me using the email we provide at the end of the podcast or the one in the show notes, or better yet, email them, grab my email and email them, copy me on the message connecting the two of us, just explaining the situation. I'll take it from there. I would appreciate that.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connections. All rights reserved.